Hello, today I'm going to be discussing some concepts from Chapter 13 of Maxfield and Babbie. Chapter 13 is all about program evaluation and policy analysis. And one of the things that's cool about Chapter 13 is it brings together all the concepts that we've been discussing literally since the beginning of the semester. So we learn about research methods in a very linear and sequential way. So like there's a chapter on the independent, dependent variables, unit of analysis, time dimension, design, sampling, all that good stuff. But I think a lot of students struggle to see how all these concepts are interrelated and how they're connected. And Chapter 13 really does a good job of bringing all that together. And in fact, I've had some students admit that they were confused about how these everything that we were learning throughout the semester was connected, but that by the time they read Chapter 13, they really got it and they really kind of saw how all these different pieces are supposed to fit together. So I think probably one of the best ways to boil this down is to just walk through a hypothetical program evaluation, and we'll talk about how all these different concepts are connected. So for the purposes of this example, let's pretend that the Florida Department of Corrections has asked us to evaluate Thinking for a Change. Thinking for a Change is a program that is designed to help inmates in prison learn pro-social coping skills, conflict resolution skills, and basically just pro-social skills in general, with the goal of avoiding recidivism. So in other words, when they're released from prison, they'll be able to hopefully manage their lives in such a way that they don't break the law and get in trouble and end up back in the system. Okay? And Thinking for a Change, incidentally, it is a real program and it's been around for a number of years. But I'm just going to use it as an example here. So let's just say we've been asked to figure out if Thinking for a Change does work in reducing recidivism in Florida inmates. So there's a number of things that we have to consider, and these are all concepts that you've been introduced to before. So we have to think about what our independent, dependent variables are, how we're going to operationalize and measure them. We have to consider the unit of analysis, the time dimension, the research design, the sampling strategy that we'll use, the data collection strategy that we'll use, how we're going to analyze our data, and then we also have to consider validity and the ethical repercussions of our study as well. So I'm going to walk through briefly just how all these fit together. So one of the first things that we want to think about is how exactly are we going to operationalize and measure some of these concepts, and what are we trying to figure out? So if we're being asked to evaluate Thinking for a Change, we could look at, does Thinking for a Change actually work? In other words, does it reduce recidivism? So if we give Thinking for Change counseling to a number of inmates, do those inmates get released and then go on to lead productive lives, or do they commit more crimes and end up back in the system? And so we need to think about how exactly we're going to operationalize some of these concepts and how we'll measure them. So we can think about this like a causal argument. So if we do Thinking for a Change, then we should see a reduction in recidivism. And from that, we can derive independent variables and dependent variables. So our independent variable in this scenario would be the Thinking for a Change program. And the dependent variable then would be recidivism. So again, we're arguing that if we do Thinking for a Change with inmates, that it should reduce recidivism. Okay, so the cause is the Thinking for Change program. The effect is the reduction in recidivism. Okay, and so we can turn the program into the independent variable and then recidivism into the dependent variable. And so we have to then think about how we are going to measure these variables in our research. And so we could come up with some ways of measuring program administration, and this would tie into our data collection strategies, which I'll discuss in just a minute. And then we could also come up with some ways of measuring recidivism. And we have to here operationalize what exactly we mean by recidivism. So in a broad sense, recidivism might mean that someone breaks the law again, okay, when they're released from prison, so they go back to engaging in a life of crime. But then we need to think about how are we going to measure that, and how, like, what sort resources do we have to measure that? So we could look at parole or probation violations and use that as a measure of recidivism. So if an inmate is released and they violate the terms of their probation and they get sent back to prison, that could be a measure of recidivism. Arrest could be a measure of recidivism. So if one of our inmates is arrested for a new offense after they're released from the program, obviously that could be a good measure. And conviction could be a measure as well. So if they're convicted of an offense. But each of these measurements have pros and cons, right? So conviction, we know there's a lot of steps leading up to a conviction, right? Someone could get arrested and not prosecuted in the end, or they could be acquitted. So conviction might be too high of a criterion, right? Even arrest is questionable because we know that the police use discretion. They don't always make arrests, right? Also, we know the police don't detect all crimes. And that could even also apply to parole and probation violations. So we know not all probation violations are written up, right? There's not always a record of them, or it's up to the ability of the probation officer to detect violations of the probation. And if they don't, then we're missing something. So again, there's no perfect measurement, but we really have to be careful in deciding how we're going to operationalize and measure recidivism here. So another thing that we have to consider is our unit of analysis. So are we going to use an individual or group unit of analysis? We'll probably start out here with the individual unit of analysis because we're going to be assigning our inmates to either receive thinking for a change or receive nothing. So we'll begin with an individual unit of analysis. But in the end, we're probably going to aggregate up to the group level because we'll be comparing between the group of our inmates that received thinking for change and the group that did not. So, we have to consider what unit of analysis we're going to use. We also have to consider the time dimension. So is this going to be a cross-sectional or a longitudinal study? Most likely it's going to be a longitudinal study if we're interested in seeing if inmates recidivate after they're released from the program. So we'll want to keep an eye on those inmates and see how they do once they're released. So cross-sectional data collection, where we only collect data at one point in time, probably wouldn't be very useful. So we'd probably want to go with a longitudinal design. And then we have to decide, are we going to do a trend, cohort, or panel? Well, since we're looking at the same inmates and the same folks, we'd probably want to do a panel design, okay? However, there could be a variation on this where maybe we do a cohort. Maybe we just look at inmates that were released from the program in a certain month, and we compare that to another group of inmates in another institution that were released in the same month as well. So the cohort, the binding event, would be the month that they were released from prison. Okay, so you could look at it and use a cohort design as well. But again, this is a decision that you have to make when you embark on a research enterprise like this. So then you have to decide what type of research design you're going to have. Are we going to have a true experimental design where we randomly assign inmates to either be in thinking for a change or be in a control condition? Okay, and we use a random assignment mechanism to do that? Or are we going to use a quasi-experimental design where, maybe we use some selection criteria to assign inmates to one or another? A lot of times when you go into a prison environment, the prison administrators may not want to do random assignment. They just might say, you know what, we got the money to do this Thinking for a Change program. We want to do it with everybody. So if that's the case and you can't do random assignment, then you're going to have to look at some kind of a quasi-experimental design. You have to also then consider, how are we going to sample? How are we going to select inmates to be in Thinking for a Change versus a control condition, assuming we have a control condition? Okay, are we interested in maybe drawing a small sample of inmates and using that to generalize to a larger population? So would that invoke discussions of a probability sampling technique? Or do we not really care about generalizing and we're selecting based on some criterion, so we might use a non-probability sampling technique? Okay, so again, we have to consider the sampling strategy that we're going to use. And then finally, we have to consider data collection. So how exactly are we going to collect data to measure our concepts of thinking for a change program administration and recidivism? So we could measure program administration through surveys, maybe of correctional staff. We could ask them their attitudes about the program if they're actually engaging in this thinking for a change with the inmates. We could do interviews, again, probably with correctional staff here. We could do field work where we actually go and observe the Thinking for a Change counseling sessions. Maybe we could even do content analysis and just see what kinds of things the counselors are writing up about the sessions, or what kind of memos are being exchanged among prison administration about the Thinking for a Change program. So we have to decide how we're going to collect this data and what technique we're going to use. How are we going to measure recidivism? Okay, how are we going to know if our inmates end up back in the system? We probably want to use official records for this, right? So some kind of probation violation reports might be one way to do it. Arrest reports or court data might be another way to determine if any of our inmates get arrested again, or if they are convicted of an offense. So again, this is something that we have to think about. Data analysis. We have to consider how we're going to analyze the data that we ultimately collect. If we are doing a comparison maybe of a group of inmates that received Thinking for a Change counseling and inmates that didn't receive anything, we probably want to do some kind of analysis of variance or ANOVA in which we analyze the outcome across multiple groups. We might also do t-test comparisons where we compare our treatment and control groups. We could also do survival analysis in which we try to calculate the time to failure. So in other words, if we know that there's going to be recidivism, we can try and figure out roughly how many days, how many weeks, how many months until you have recidivism. All right, and some of these techniques are a bit more advanced than what we talk about in research methods, but I'm just bringing this up to kind of show you this is what we have to consider in planning an evaluation. We have to consider validity. Okay, so again, whenever we do a study, we always have to consider our sources of validity threats. Right, so internal validity probably is going to have to do with the research design. How are we going to limit the threats to internal validity? External validity, how are the findings of our study going to be generalizable to other inmates, other prison populations? Statistical conclusion validity, how big of a sample of inmates do we need to draw in order to derive findings that are supportable, right? That, that we have findings that are accurate and, not due to sampling problems. Measurement validity, okay? How do we measure program delivery? How do we measure recidivism? Are our measures, do they have construct validity, face validity, criterion validity, content validity? All right, so these are, again, all areas that we have to consider in a research enterprise. And then finally, ethics. So if we do Thinking for a Change, how do we know that participation in the program is voluntary? How do we document voluntary participation? Because we can't force this on all the inmates. If we use a random assignment mechanism and we have treatment and control groups, then we have to acknowledge that, yeah, there's some inmates that are not going to get the Thinking for a Change counseling. And technically, those inmates are probably going to recidivate, right? They're probably going to recidivate at a higher rate than the inmates that received the program. So what are we going to do for those inmates? How are we going to make things right for them? Okay, so these are some ethical considerations that we have. So basically, that pretty much wraps it up. But again, just remember that when we do a program evaluation, these are some of the considerations. These aren't all the considerations, but these are some of the considerations, some of the key ones. And I just wanted to highlight these specifically because they relate to things that we've learned in the course up until this point. And so this is how all these different categories in terms of, data collection and sampling and design and how everything really kind of fits together and is interconnected. So anyway, that pretty much wraps it up for chapter 13. If you have any questions, as always, I encourage you to reach out. You can send me an email, contact me through Canvas, or you can leave a comment here on YouTube. Thank you.